This is Ancient Faith Today with Father Tom Soroka, a weekly live call-in show addressing the issues of our day from a distinctly Orthodox perspective. You can join the conversation by calling in at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Father Tom is the priest at St. Nicholas Orthodox Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and welcomes guests from across the globe to discuss important topics of interest. Here's Father Tom.
Welcome to Ancient Faith Today. This is Father Tom Soroka, and I'm so glad that you're with us this evening. We'll be taking your calls in a bit at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. John will be answering your calls tonight, so please make sure to turn the show volume off before you come on air. You can also join us in the chat room, which is now open, by going to ancientfaith.com/live. Another way to connect with us is to go to facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday and place your question in the thread for tonight's show. You can also send us an email at aft@ancientfaith.com. And remember that our show is being simulcast live weekly on the AFR Facebook and YouTube pages. So let's get started. Though tonight's show might be most appreciated by church history geeks, I think that there will be some information of interest for all of our listeners. It's impossible to talk about church history, especially in the 3rd century, without discussing the most influential teacher and theologian of that century, Origen of Alexandria, who lived from approximately 184 to 253 AD. He was an early Christian scholar, ascetic, a prolific writer who wrote roughly 2,000 treatises in multiple branches of theology, including textual criticism, biblical exegesis, biblical hermeneutics, homiletics, and spirituality. He was one of the most influential figures in early Christian theology, apologetics, and asceticism. He's described by the eminent Orthodox thinker, Father John McGuckin, as, quote, the greatest genius of the early church that they have ever produced. When Origen was 18 years old, he became a catechist at the Catechetical School of Alexandria. But he came into conflict with the Bishop of Alexandria, Demetrius, in 231 after he was ordained as a presbyter by his friend, the Bishop of Caesarea, while on a journey to Athens through Palestine. Demetrius immediately condemned Origen for insubordination and accused him of having castrated himself and of having taught that Satan would eventually attain salvation, an accusation which Origen vehemently denied. Origen founded the Christian school of Caesarea thereafter, where he taught logic, cosmology, natural history, and theology, and he became regarded by all the churches of Palestine and Arabia as the ultimate authority on all matters of theology. His treatise On the First Principles systematically laid out the basics of Christian theology, and it became the foundation for later theological writings. He was tortured for his faith during the Decian persecutions in 250 AD and died 3 to 4 years later from his injuries. Pope Dionysius of Alexandria hailed him as a martyr for the faith. His teachings were especially influential to later teachers such as St. Athanasius the Great, St. Basil the Great, St. Gregory the Theologian, and St. Gregory of Nyssa, who called him the Prince of Christian Learning, those being among his most devoted followers. However, in the late 4th century, Bishop Epiphanius of Salamis, who was determined to root out all heresies and refute them, attacked Origen in his writings, compiling a list of teachings Origen has espoused that Epiphanius regarded as heretical, including subordinationism, the idea that the Son and the Spirit are subordinate to the Father. Epiphanius's writings portray Origen as an originally Orthodox Christian who had been corrupted and turned into a heretic. Origen's writing on the first principles became a tool for both supporters and detractors to prove either his orthodoxy or his heresy, as the Latin translations had become hopelessly corrupted from the now lost originals. In 399, Pope Theophilus of Alexandria labeled Origen as, quote, the Hydra of all heresies, in a move to placate Alexandrian monks who believed that God actually had a literal human-like body, that is, God the Father, when Origen rightly taught that God was incorporeal. Later in the 6th century, another controversy arose which ended in eventually condemning Origen at the Fifth Ecumenical Council based on writings that were attributed to him, but were actually written by Evagrius Ponticus. Because his writings were ordered to be burned by the Emperor Justinian, it's difficult to determine what his original writings actually said. It's likely that the writings containing Origen's most unusual and speculative ideas have been lost to time, making it nearly impossible to determine whether Origen actually held all the heretical views which the anathemas against him ascribed to him. Regardless of these historical facts, some will surely question why we're even taking the time to discuss a condemned heretic on our show. Of course, as Orthodox Christians, and listen closely, we must affirm what the Orthodox Church has upheld as true, and we must condemn those teachings which are shown to be false and heretical. As a priest, I will die proclaiming the unadulterated Orthodox faith. So, our purpose here tonight is not to rehabilitate Origen, nor to campaign for his canonization, nor to defend whichever of his teachings were actually heretical, since there are most certainly teachings which he espoused that later proved to be unorthodox. But Origen is still worthy of note for having played a crucially important role in the history of Christian theology and thought, actually unparalleled in his time. It is impossible for us to consider Christian history or biblical theology without dealing with Origen. Even today, after all of those controversies, after being condemned as a heretic at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, he is still widely regarded, as Father John Meindorf put it, the father of Christian theology. So tonight, to help us guide us in this conversation, we have with us Ambrose Andreano. Ambrose holds a BA in theology from Liberty University. He's the creator of the website blacklionacademy.com, and he's a member of Holy Apostles Orthodox Church in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Ambrose, welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Hey, Father Tom. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad you're here. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
All right, good. Well, I'm glad you're here. I know that you have great admiration and a knowledge of Origen, and I hope that our listeners were put at ease to know that, we are here to promote the Orthodox faith, but we are a talk show, and we talk about sometimes controversial issues. Origen is certainly controversial even to this day, 1700 years later, and so because of his great influence in theology, he's certainly worthy of discussion. So, Ambrose, I want to get to know you a little bit. We've been Facebook friends for a long time. Of course, I know your wonderful priest, Father Timothy Honicki, and I want to know a little bit about you, about your religious background. My understanding is you came into the church a few years ago. Tell us about your religious journey and your study of theology and what attracted you to orthodoxy, please.
Sure. Firstly, real quick, I just wanted to give a shout out to Marlena Graves, who was just on. She did a great job. Anyway,
she was great.
Yeah. Anyway, my background is in the evangelical world. I've been through about 10 different denominations, and I've experienced just about every corner of the low church world, ranging from everything from like King James onlyism to charismatic Pentecostalism. I've kind of seen it all. The main thing that brought me to Orthodoxy was actually discovering the Church Fathers through Ancient Faith Radio. particularly through Ginny Constantinu's Search the Scriptures podcast.
Wow.
Yeah, I burned through like every single episode of hers, which at the time was about like 7 years of content. I went through it in
Wow,
like
she's
4 months.
That's
Um,
amazing.
I've been a student of the scriptures since I was a teenager, and I was that kid having friendly debates with Jehovah's Witnesses by 20 years old, defending the divinity of Christ. So I was that guy. Um, when I discovered the Patrista Corpus, it really gave me a newfound passion for discovering what the ancient church believed about everything. I pretty quickly found myself agreeing with the Orthodox on a variety of things, and I always had a more creative, mystical, Eastern tinge to my theological and exegetical perspective. Perhaps due to my dyslexia, I don't know. But I just connected personally with the Eastern Fathers more than the Western Fathers, which led me to Eastern Orthodoxy over, say, Roman Catholicism. And it goes without saying that Origen is the one figure I felt a unique connection with on a personal level that I didn't experience with any other figure, as great as they may be.
I know that you have an appreciation for Origen, as I had said before, and he has a way of looking at Scripture where he talks about the two meaning of Scriptures, or sort of two layers, and this deeper, more mystical meaning. And you're saying that has really captured your imagination and your heart in terms of the way that you look at the Scriptures?
Yeah, definitely. I've always just had a natural drawing to mystical exegesis. That's kind of just what I've naturally seen in the text. And yeah, Origen fits right into that.
Yeah, it seems like when we talk about there's the two schools, the Antiochian school and the Alexandrian school. So for our listeners, the Alexandrian school is a more allegorical understanding of the Scriptures, and the Antiochian school being a more literal understanding of the Scriptures to a certain extent. So do you feel like the allegorical, before we get to the questions tonight, do you feel like the allegorical and the mystical understanding of the Scriptures and that way of looking at the Scriptures has somehow been lost, especially in the West, with modern critical theory regarding the Scriptures and the way in which the Scriptures are handled as sola scriptura and so forth? Do you think that's really kind of a missing piece in the West?
In my opinion, I would say so. I think, I don't know if it's due to our modern scientific materialist kind of Western society that values historical critical method in such a high place, that mystical theology has kind of like went by the wayside. But to clarify a little bit of what you said, just to give a little nuance,
Sure.
The Alexandrian school and the Antiochian school weren't really like literal schools. It wasn't like, because a lot of people have this understanding that like Alexandrians just liked allegory and didn't like literal interpretations, and the Antiochians liked the literal and hated the allegory or whatever. But like the Alexandrians differed with one another. Like Origen is different than, say, Theophilus and Cyril of Alexandria, and like
right.
And in the Antiochians, Chrysostom is not the same as like Theodore of Mopsuestia. So there's some like nuances even in those specific camps. So just as an aside.
No, that's a great thing. Thanks for pointing that out. All right, so tonight we're talking about Origen. As we said at the beginning, we normally don't spend a lot of time studying the works of quote unquote condemned heretics in the church, right? We're reading the lives of the saints, and we're reading the truths of the church and so forth. Nobody really reads the works of Arius today, right? And there are people that feel like the writings of Origen have value today. So obviously you're fond of his writings. What would you say differentiates Origen? Now, I'm obviously, some people would see all heretics in the same way. In other words, they would place Arius in the same camp as Origen. But I think what we're trying to do here is make a little bit of a distinction. And the idea is, what is the distinction between someone like Origen versus somebody like Arius?
Sure. Well, first, I just want to thank you for having me on and being interested to discuss this. It speaks to your character, and I'm blessed to be a friend. To answer your question,
I'm glad you're here. Mm-hmm.
thanks. I would respond by saying Arius was at least given the opportunity to stand trial at the Council of Nicaea, and he gave an account of what he actually believed. He had the opportunity to clarify himself, lest his opponents accuse him falsely of views he didn't actually hold. Origen, on the other hand, in his life, he was in his lifetime the leader of the Orthodox side of theology. He was being summoned everywhere to settle theological debates and against the heretics of his day. And he was condemned by people hundreds of years after his death for views he didn't even hold within entirely unrelated circumstances. Not only this, but he had many supporters in between that time period, most of which are saints who used him explicitly to argue against the heretical beliefs of their day and to craft Nicene orthodoxy. But we'll get to all that later, I assume.
Okay, so your point is what then? That the idea is that Origen had this popularity, he had this authority that he held among the Christian teachers and bishops and so forth of his day. Mm-hmm. And when he was condemned, although I'll ask for clarification here, though he was mostly condemned at the end of, far past the end of his life, didn't he also undergo some condemnation and accusations, especially from the Bishop of Alexandria, regarding, when he had received ordination at another bishop's hand? They sort of accused him of, like I said in the intro, of holding certain views. So it wasn't like he was only condemned at the end of his, after the end of his life. He was condemned during his life too, in certain respects. Yes.
He was, in a sense. I was going to talk about that when I go over his life. Did you want me to skip and just talk about it now?
No, we could do that, but I just wanted to clarify that. We'll go there, but the point is that he did have to face some charges of false teaching in his life.
The major charges with Demetrius was in there were two councils. There was one in AD 230 and another one in AD 232, and the major issues were with regards to Origen. So, like earlier, Demetrius didn't like Origen teaching people without being a priest, and so Origen ends up becoming a priest, and then that scandalized Demetrius, and so his insubordination was really the thing that projected these councils. And in the first council in AD 230, Origen, they wanted to ban Origen from both teaching and living in Alexandria. But, and this is the strange thing, he was allowed to remain a priest. So that is just kind of like a weird thing. And so, but Origen wins that one. And then the second council happens in 232. And then that's one that St. Pamphilus says that deprives him of the priesthood in Alexandria.
Right. Yeah. Eventually he loses his priesthood. Right.
Yeah.
And that's when he starts the other school, right?
Yeah. That's eventually he heads off to Caesarea.
Yeah. All right. So we have a question here in the chat room from Albert. And he says, if even the demons can quote scripture and twist them to lead people astray, think Christ's temptation in the desert, cannot the same be said about the writings of Origen? That is not to compare the scriptures with the writings of Origen, which are nonetheless steeped in scripture. In other words, which of his writings are explicitly heretical such that they cannot be interpreted charitably at all? So let's I want to reformulate his question just a little bit, because he, in terms of the scriptures, let's maybe deal with, I know we're jumping around a little bit, but let's deal with Albert's question here first about, can you trust the writings of Origen? I think that's actually a really interesting question, because it's probably less simple than people think, right? Can you trust the writings of Origen? Let's just ask that.
I would say yes, mainly because you can make that argument about literally anyone. And so at some point, you have to kind of discern, okay, secondary sources of authority. So you have to look at who can we trust to give us an accurate depiction of Origen's orthodoxy, right? So then you would look to saints like St. Pamphilus and St. Athanasius and the Cappadocians and all those people. So I think those saints in and of themselves have the authority to speak against that kind of accusation.
In other words, they're defending him and his writings.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Very good. So here's another question. I did go through kind of a high level of Origen's life in the intro, but I know that there's kind of a little bit more of a complicated backstory. There's an important context there. So help us understand a little bit more about Origen's career in the church. When you read about his life, you get this kind of sense of he has this sheer devotion to Christ, and he has this desire to teach Christian truth. But it does seem from the day of his ordination on, especially from, the Bishop of Alexandria, he was dogged by detractors. Even though he had tremendous followers, he also was dogged by detractors, and even to this day. So hundreds of years later, he gets condemned twice, once by an ecumenical council. He is really pilloried among some these days. So, give us a little bit of perspective about this. Why do you feel like his life was the way it was, where he was so devoted to Christ, he was so devoted to Christian truth, he gets slammed by his detractors, and even to this day, you have these kind of polar opposite views of Origen. I wouldn't personally say that he's a saint or anything like that, but I would say, sometimes I feel like he is somewhat unfairly treated by history. So, because we don't, necessarily have the original sources. So help us through that question of his life and give us some of the nuances of the problem of his life.
Sure. So his life comes from Eusebius of Caesarea, specifically book 6 of Ecclesiastical History. And Eusebius says that he's getting his information from like these letters of people who claim to have firsthand acquaintance with Origen. And in the opening part of the account, Eusebius kind of opens with showing us how Origen is the son of a martyr. So it opens with Saint Leonides, who is a saint, and
his father.
kind of his father, his martyrdom. That's kind of how it opens, and then we don't really know much about him except what Eusebius tells us, and he kind of just tells us that he raised Origen from a very young age to study the scriptures, and so he ends up getting carried off to be killed, and teenage Origen, who is about 16 years old at this point, he's zealously trying to go die with him and be a martyr. But as Christ would have it, Origen's mother, after failing to persuade him through other means, she hides his clothes and leaving him naked, and so he's not able to leave the house. Eusebius says that this was by divine providence, of course. And so Origen started out from then on, he kind of needed to become the breadwinner. And so he started out as a philosopher to pay the bills. And then that eventually leads him to the catechetical school in Alexandria, over which the church had authority. And that was when he was only 18 years old. So he succeeds Clement of Alexandria. And that was, I believe that was when most people fled the city because of local threats of persecution. And just a little gist about Origen, he was very ascetic. Many people point to him as being the prototype of what would become Christian monasticism. Asceticism back then was just called the philosophical life, because the true philosopher was viewed as one who lived in such a way that displayed their own philosophical teachings. A philosopher was not just like an abstract speculator. Eusebius says there was a saying that went something like, quote, "As was his speech, so was his life, and as was his life, so was his speech," unquote, which seems to be a reference to Plato's Republic. Eusebius says that Origen carried out labors of discipline in the day, studied the scriptures late into the night, presumably by candlelight. He would do things like visit the martyrs, exhorting and encouraging them before they would receive their quote-unquote baptism by fire. And that got him in a lot of trouble. Apparently, Origen was almost killed too many times to count. Origen had many pupils, male and female, some of whom were still catechumens, and most of them kept getting killed. It really is amazing that Origen survived this time period, considering he was like the most prominent teacher of the most hated demographic in Alexandria. Origen also slept on the floor and walked around barefoot for many years. And that was in reference to Matthew 10:10. And
so in other words, your point is that he was living an ascetical life while he was teaching. In other words, he wasn't just teaching, but he was really living this out. Ambrose, I'm gonna pause you right there because I know we're not through this. What we're gonna do is we have several questions in the chat room. We're going to go to those, but first we're going to go to a quick break. We want to remind everybody it's 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. If you're a history buff and you want to ask a question about Origen, if you're really ticked off that we're talking about Origen, call in. Let's talk about this. We have some people in the chat room that have some questions. So Ambrose, hold on. We're going to be right back.
Father Tom will be back in a moment. In the meantime, the lines are open at 855-237-2346. Don't go away.
The doctrine of hell as a place of eternal punishment has never been easy for Christians to accept. The temptation to retreat from and reject the Church's traditional teaching about hell is particularly strong in our current culture, which has demonstrably lost its sense of sin. Father Lawrence Farley examines the Orthodox Church's teachings on this difficult subject through the lens of scripture and patristic writings, making the case that the existence of hell does not negate that of a loving and forgiving God.
If we're going to talk about heaven, hell, the kingdom, universalism, salvation, condemnation, need to look at the data. What does the Bible say? What did the Father say? So the book simply aims at giving person the information all in one spot to say, what does the Orthodox Church, taught by the Scriptures and the Fathers, what does it actually teach?
For this book and many others like it, you can go to store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Ancient Faith Today and Father Tom Soroka. Give us a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Father Tom.
We're back talking with Ambrose Andreano. We're talking about Origen. And Ambrose, you were in the middle of talking about the life of Origen. You were speaking about his dedication to the ascetical life, which was called the philosophical life, which I've never heard that before. That was wonderful to hear. So please, if you could finish that, and I apologize for interrupting your flow again, tell us about the rest of his life.
All right, thanks. So yeah, he was ascetic. He didn't drink alcohol. He didn't eat anything that was unnecessary for sustenance. So the guy was clearly like a monk and living in a city. Eusebius also talks about Origen castrating himself, which I personally don't think actually happened, but we don't have to talk about that now if you don't want to. His bishop...
That's fine.
You want to talk about it? All right. So Eusebius says that when Origen was a catechist, he castrated himself in rashness because he took Christ's words, quote, "There are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven," unquote, that he took that too literally. And the understanding was that he wanted to be above reproach because he had a decent amount of women under his tutelage. Many scholars, including Father John Bear, Father John McGuckin, agree with Henry Chadwick that this was probably a result of malicious gossip. McGuckin says that the story was lurid enough to ensure that it was the one thing that people remember about Origen. Right. And that Origen's own commentary on Matthew 19:12 should be prioritized over secondhand statements from Eusebius, where he basically says that only an idiot would take that literally. So I do have my own theory about this. So I'll just throw it out there.
Shoot.
to throw stuff against the wall. So we know for a fact in his commentary that Origen understood Christ's words about eunuchs to be essentially mystical speak in reference to celibacy. In other words, Christ is calling every willfully celibate person a eunuch because they have effectively castrated themselves with the decision to live in celibacy, the vow of singleness acting as castration. Origen was himself a celibate man who, like Christ, spoke casually with a mystical tongue. Because I've read a great deal of Origen, and I think I have a pretty good grasp of the way he thinks, my theory is that Origen probably openly referred to himself as a eunuch because it kills three birds with one stone. Number one, it would let those who are initiated in this mystical language to be aware of his celibacy. Number two, it would let the women under him know that he's off the market, whether they know what he's talking about or not. And number three, it would let those who are not initiated in this language know that he is above reproach concerning women because they think he's a literal eunuch. Wow. And so I think this theory answers far too many questions for it not to be true, which is why I think Origen openly calling himself a eunuch in reference to his own celibacy is where this all originates, and not because Origen actually went through a literal surgery, which McGuckin says would have been massively debilitating, which is in contradiction to Origen's long and healthy life.
Interesting.
And I find it also unlikely that people actually demanded that Origen expose himself for confirmation, nor is there evidence of this happening. So this was probably all hearsay that came from literally taking Origen at his word, which is what Bishop Demetrius did.
And actually, it would be funny for him to be literal about something when he held the views of Scripture,
Right.
that were mystical, and so that's pretty clever. Thank you very much.
And that's
go ahead.
the other like argument against the castration thing, is because it makes no sense for the person, like the one person who popularized like allegorical interpretation, to be guilty of such an extreme literal interpretation of the text that not even the most extreme interpreters of the text would follow him. So that's just like a total inconsistency. That doesn't make any sense.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, that's pretty cool. 1-855-AF-radio. That's 1-855-237-2346. Ambrose, we have a phone call from Tiberius. Tiberius, welcome to Ancient Faith Today. You're on the line with Ambrose Andreano.
Thank you, Father. Thank you for taking my call. I'm a little comment on the question. I'm from Romania original, just to everybody know. Elder Cleopa from Romania, very, very high level monk and theologian.
Cleopa.
Maybe everybody know. Yeah. He said about Origen couple of things. First of all, I mean, the main reason he was, from the Holy Synod, and was, how you say, get apostles. I don't know the word in English. Heretical, right? He was heretical because he had that apostle. I mean, how you say, apostle?
Apokatastasis.
Right.
Apokatastasis.
Right. Very hard for me to say that word. Yeah. And Elder
That's
Cleopa
okay.
Said it's only three, and the word the make it when the God make the word, the resurrection of the Christ, and the second coming of the Christ. Only three. And Origen he said is coming will be the fourth one when everybody will be saved, even the demons, and will be and that was actually the very, very big problem. He was, and now, but my question is, I heard, maybe you can tell us, I heard Origen and his writing, he said this: if I said something wrong in my writings, or something does, people they don't understand, don't. I mean, he said something, maybe I could be wrong, on all my writings, so I could be wrong, so don't take it, like 100% what I said is true, like a dogma, you know what I mean? So that could be his salvation,
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good question. It's actually the next thing we were going to talk about. So, Tiberius, that was a perfect question. Thank you for calling. We're gonna actually talk about this now. So let's talk about this idea, Ambrose, and that is that Origen taught this idea of the apokatastasis, or this, salvation of all, which, eventually was passed on to Saint Gregory of Nyssa, who also taught this, because Saint Gregory was a great admirer of Origen. Now, let me do my editorial comment here and say, we're talking about this from an informational standpoint. We're not promoting this. We're just simply saying this is what he taught, right? So to Tiberius's question, talk a little bit about the heretical views, or what were considered heresies that Origen taught.
Okay. So let me just skip ahead here. So that question was specifically about universalism, right?
Well, I mean, just, the idea here is, the councils had condemned heresies. There were provincial councils that had condemned some of his heresies. And so, there's a controversy about some of the views that he held that were either not or were heresies. So can we go through some of those things, right? Can we go through some of those teachings that were condemned as heresies?
Yeah. So just real quick with the universalism stuff, like you mentioned, there are people after him who also believe that, like you said, St. Gregory of Nyssa. You also have St. Isaac the Syrian, and you have a bunch of people who also hold it.
Mm-hmm.
And but I did want to discuss some of the other allegations.
Sure, go ahead.
So basically, shortly after Origen's death, his writings became disputed between saints. So this was between saints. Okay. Basically, everybody was reading him. So Origen's works were essentially a kind of grad level catechism. That's kind of like what they unofficially became. Everyone was talking about it. Some people loved him. Others fixated on things they found to be issues. The two beginning figures, the two major ones disputing over Origen, were Saint Methodius of Olympus and Saint Pamphilus of Caesarea. And Pamphilus was like one of the biggest fans of Origen. He read his works extensively. Methodius was also another mystical theologian who used allegorical exegesis. But he found some things, or at least he thought he did, that were problems in Origen. Pamphilus then sees the things Methodius was saying and then writes a whole apology for Origen that directly refutes basically everything, all of the negative assertions that Methodius had about Origen without naming him, and basically shows that Methodius was misinterpreting Origen. There are 9 assertions from Methodius that he sets out to refute. And his takedown is pretty devastating, I might add. But I lost my spot here. But I do encourage listeners to read St. Pamphilus, because he already clarifies like 90% of all of the controversy.
Where would we find that writing of St. Pamphilus? So
the version I have is by Catholic University of America Press, the English version, and that's the one I recommend. It's like the English is good and it's easy to follow. The footnotes are helpful, so that's the one I would recommend.
Okay, cool. All right, we have another caller, Raphael. Raphael, you're on the line with Ambrose Andreano. Welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Father. I had this weird thought. We talk about Origen espousing this idea of, the salvation of all, right? And so I got to thinking about that Rob Bell character who was big to do in the emergent church. Also, yeah, I'm glad you're
love wins, yeah. Right?
Yeah. But so anyway, so both these people espouse that, okay, everyone's going to be there in the resurrection and everyone's going to be saved. But then I also look back to people like St. Herman of Alaska and other saints that have said that hell is really the unrighteous kind of burning in the glory of God and not being able to, take it. And their hell is that they're in the presence of God. So, and I know this is a stretch and maybe just a weird theory, but so maybe in that sense, the idea is correct that, like, okay, yes, everyone is saved, like our souls are eternal, yet those that have gone against Christ and God and the teachings of the church are there to suffer in the light of his love. Thoughts?
Well, before Ambrose answers that, I do want to say one thing, and that is, not all Orthodox teachers teach that hell is the love of God. Okay. For instance, I know Father Thomas Hopko certainly espouse that idea. I don't want to speak for him, but you know, I think if you listen to his teachings on Ancient Faith Radio, there's just no doubt that that's what he taught. There are other teachers that would reject that idea, that hell is not simply the presence of God, but, you know, and I would say if you listen to the commercial that was on there during the break, you know, Father Lawrence Farley wrote a book, Unquenchable Fire, published by Ancient Faith, and that book certainly does not espouse that view. It espouses the view that hell is separation from God. And in fact, I did a show with him on universalism, so the listeners can go back and listen to that. But anyway, I did want to make that clear, Raphael, before we go on to the answer of Ambrose, that, you know, the idea is that that's not necessarily the definitive Orthodox teaching, that hell is the presence of God. Go ahead, Ambrose. Can you reconcile those two? Can you reconcile apokatastasis and this idea that hell is the presence of God?
Most definitely, because that whole notion of hell, of the fire of hell being the love of God, comes from universalists. Like, that's straight out of St. Isaac the Syrian. So that's kind of like, that's been spliced out of that whole framework to then fit into an eternal hell framework. So that's kind of, because that's the whole background of like the universalist paradigm. I should say the patristic universalist paradigm, because some modern beliefs are just totally alien to the ancient world. But yeah, like the unquenchable fire to a universalist is referring to the fire of love, because you have Scripture says that God is a consuming fire, and then it explains the nature of this fire when it says God is love. And then in Song of Solomon it says, quote, "Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it," unquote. So that's the universalist paradigm. And I actually wrote a 30-page essay titled Patristic Universalism that goes over all of this. I kind of refute all the misconceptions. I explain in detail the inner workings of the whole system, just so people can get an idea of what it actually asserts, so they actually know what they're disagreeing with, if they disagree. So I encourage people to check that out.
Excellent.
Raphael, any reactions? Thoughts?
No,
comments?
I'm so glad that you guys are having this conversation, because it's so wild these days with internet orthodoxy that it's good to have a little clarification. So thank you both so much for
we're glad you listened.
Thanks
you
for
listening.
being reasonable.
Yeah, no worries.
All right. Hey, we have a question from Facebook Live before we go to our next caller. And it says, what is Ambrose's thoughts on Origen's doctrine of justification? What about his commentary on Romans? This is from a Roman Catholic listener. Are you familiar with that? Does Origen have a doctrine of justification?
I got to admit, this question is kind of a deep cut. I did read his commentary on Romans, but I can't by memory remember like all the things he said about justification. So,
well, maybe that listener, that, you know, what we can do is, John, if we can get that listener to message us or something, we can get back to them.
Yes, and email me.
Ambrose can work on it. All right, good. All right, thank you very much. The next caller is Dell from Louisville. Dell, welcome to Ancient Faith Today. You're on with Ambrose Andreano.
Yeah, thanks. So, reading Origen and all, and thinking about how he actually influenced, I believe, some of the Kabbalician fathers very much, and I think it was St. Basil the Great who actually compiled a group of teachings from Origen called the Philokalia of Origen. So I was thinking how much of the criticism of Origen was actually Origen, and how much of it was his later followers? And also, as a follow-up to that question, are the principles of the allegorical interpretation from the Alexandrian school of thought still applicable today for people who are interested in reading the Bible and the patristics and all?
Okay, great questions. Did you catch that first question, Ambrose?
Could you repeat it?
Del, just repeat the first question. I caught the second one, but the first one I wasn't totally clear on.
Yeah, the first question was how much, knowing that Origen actually influenced the Cappadocian Fathers and a few other saints, how much of the later criticism of Origen and even the councils were criticizing directly Origen, and how much his later followers?
Right. In other words, Ambrose, in the condemnation of Origen, how much of it was truly of Origen's making, and how much of it was really due to maybe his later followers misdirecting things, misunderstanding things, taking things too far? How can you unpack that? So, two questions there. The later condemnation of Origen, what really is to blame there? And number two, the idea of the Alexandrian understanding of Scripture. How much is that applicable today?
I'll answer the second one first, real quickly. The Origenian mystical exegesis is certainly applicable today, and I actually wrote a very long essay on it. You could also find on the website. It's titled Origen's Mystical Exegesis. I kind of go over what it is, explain the value of it, and even how to do it. So you can go check that one out. So on the question of the later condemnations, almost none of it is applicable to Origen. By the time the 6th century comes around, Origen's theology is so muddied by ridiculous polemics that there doesn't seem to be anything genuine left of him remaining. People like Cyril of Scythopolis, Kyriakos the Anchorite, Theodore of Scythopolis, Anastasius of Sinai, and Abba Barsanufius said things about the quote-unquote Origenists, who were actually the Evagrians, such as, quote, they, the Origenists, did not maintain that Christ, the true God, is one of the holy and consubstantial Trinity, unquote. Actually, Origen agrees with this. They also equated the teachings of Origen with Arianism, Jewish blasphemies, and even Nestorius, which is just ridiculous. The real Origen could not look more different than this imaginary portrait. Anastasius of Sinai even says, quote, Origen taught that Christ was a mere man, unquote. No, Origen did not teach that Christ was a mere man. Abba Barsanufius said that the Origenists were Gnostics. All of this stuff is just anti-Origenist propaganda. It's a polemic that is presumably based entirely on a misunderstanding of what Origen actually said. Now, how did all this start? Right? That's the question. In the days of St. Justinian. Should we get into that?
Yeah, let's mention it quickly because we're running out of time from the show.
Okay.
But, the idea is, what happened to his works, et cetera, et cetera. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there were Evagrian groups in Palestine. One of them was called the Isochristoi. And they believed that the human spiritual intellect, the nous, both had a beginning of its existence, and at the end of its ascent, both of those times are equal to Christ. Isochristoi means those who assume equality with Christ. And this could be why people like Anastasius of Sinai said Origen believed that Christ was a mere man, because this would be the implication of what the Isochristoi were said to believe. Now, the rival group were known as the Protoktistoi. They apparently believed that, and I keep saying apparently because I honestly don't know precisely what is truth and what is rhetoric. They believe that the soul of Jesus was the firstborn of the whole choir of souls destined to ascend to God and the supreme nous, which is why their name means the first createds. The latter, the protoktistoi, were accused of elevating a created soul into the Trinity as a fourth person of the Godhead, which obviously would sound to some to be very Nestorian. And the former, the isochristoi, were largely seen as scandalously reducing Christ to the ranks of created souls. Now, in 543, the protoktistoi appealed to Justinian. Letters were written. Supposedly, some quotes from on first principles were proof texted by them against the isochristoi. Anathemata were attached. Texts were cited, turned out to be from Evagrius and not Origen. But this is what circulates in the imperial courts. Now, Origen is then eventually viewed as the head of the isochristoi. And at least for this century, Origen's fate is pretty much sealed from there. The image of Origen essentially becomes one with the isochristoi, and this is how Origen is perceived by Justinian and the rest of it. And the imperial authoritarian campaign against speculation and intellectual freedom begins. So this is kind of what happens.
That's interesting. And he was a man who, I think the way that he taught is, you know, the idea there is that when he taught, he wanted his students to kind of come to the conclusion without him telling them that, right?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, McGuckin talks about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a comment before we wrap this up. There was a comment in the chat room about what were the actual charges against Origen. I'm just going to read something here. This is from Orthodox Christianity, Volume 1 by Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev. And basically, he says that the notions that were condemned were the notion that human souls pre-existed in the world of ideas, but then fell away from divine contemplation and were sent into bodies for punishment. The belief that the soul of Jesus Christ pre-existed and was united with God the Word before the incarnation of the Virgin, while his body was first formed in the womb of the Virgin, and only after that, united with God the Word. The teaching that God the Word likened himself to the entire celestial hierarchy by becoming a cherubim for the cherubim and the seraphim for the seraphim, the idea that the bodies of people will rise again in a spherical form, the view that the sky, sun, moon, stars, and spaces higher than the waters are animated, the belief that Christ will be crucified in the age to come for the sake of demons as well as for people, the idea that God's might is limited in space and that he created only as many things as he could encompass, the teaching that the punishment of the demons and the impious is only temporary and will end at a certain time. That is, there will be a restoration, apokatastasis, of the demons and the wicked. So those were the charges against him. And, ultimately what you're saying here is that the works that we have of Origen today are somewhat unreliable in those particular areas. Would that not be correct?
I would say mostly no, because like I said, those accusations are not directly being pulled from Origen's works. Those are accusations that are being interpreted through the speculations of the isochristoi. So they're just kind of being conflated as being the same thing as Origen. And,
as Origenists.
Right. And the Origenists were just a group of, there were a group of people. They didn't even agree with each other. They were just kind of like, they were all conflated. They were all called Origenists. But, So for example, there was like this accusation against Origen that he believed in reincarnation. Okay. So here's a quote from Origen in his commentary on Matthew. This is in book 13. Okay, quote, "In this place it does not appear to me that Elijah the soul is spoken of, lest I fall into the doctrine of transmigration, which is foreign to the Church of God, and not handed down by the apostles, nor anywhere set forth in the scriptures, unquote. So clearly, whoever was asserting that he believed in reincarnation didn't see that, right? Origen did speculate a belief in pedagogical ages, which St. Gregory the Theologian affirms as being worthy speculation. Like, speculating is not like an inherent evil. And even in Origen's day, like, there were all kinds of speculations about the origin of the soul and all of that. Like, that wasn't like a dogma handed down from the apostles. That was open to interpretation, open to discussion. But obviously this isn't the same as reincarnation. It's not like you start as a bug and then become a goat and then a person or whatever. Not only does the species remain the same in Origen's conception, but persons remain the same. So Elijah doesn't die in one generation and become John the Baptist in another. So for Origen, he's looking at the scriptural data. He's making a hypothesis about there being ages beyond the limited window of the future that we have been given. And then and the pedagogical purposes of those ages. So that's what he's thinking about. And I mentioned Gregory the Theologian because he says the following with regards to this very speculation in Origen. Quote, philosophize about the world or worlds, about matter, about soul, about natures endowed with reason, good or bad, about resurrection, about judgment, about reward or sufferings of Christ. And this is the key. For in these subjects, to hit the mark is not useless, and to miss it is not dangerous, unquote. This is important to understand, because what Gregory is saying is that getting stuff like this wrong is entirely irrelevant to the faith. It's okay to be wrong about most things. And Gregory encourages people to engage in speculation because getting it right can actually be a great thing. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about that.
Thank you very, very much. Ambrose, thanks for your time today. Appreciate it very, very much. It was a really interesting conversation. I know it was very challenging for some people, but it's good to discuss these things. I am certainly not one to say that somehow, we can't discuss someone who had such a tremendous influence on the Cappadocian Fathers, on St. Gregory Nyssa, on so many and so much of our theology. And so we want to thank you very, very much for your knowledge and your thoughts today. Appreciate it very, very much. Thanks, Ambrose.
Thank you for having me.
Many thanks to Ambrose Andreano for sharing his knowledge and insight with us tonight. Thanks to John for engineering the program, for everybody in the chat room, for those listening, those that called in, and for those who will be listening to the podcast. Whatever our view of Origen, God willing, we can all agree on these words about Orthodox teaching penned by him. There are many who think they hold the opinions of Christ, and yet some of these think differently from their predecessors. Yet, as the teaching of the Church, transmitted in orderly succession from the apostles and remaining in the churches to this present day, is still preserved, that alone is to be accepted as truth, which differs in no respect from church and apostolic tradition. And that's our show for tonight. Remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday. Share out our program after that's posted. Give us your feedback and contact us with any ideas or topics that you might want to hear about. Join us next Tuesday evening for the next edition of Ancient Faith Today. We'll be talking with Deacon David John Williams about Turkey's recent ruling to use the famed Hagia Sophia in Istanbul as a mosque. Good night, everybody.